I was going to spend the afternoon relaxing a little bit, in a bit of a therapeutic way, uh, spending several hours assaulting the old car in a garage. It's a 1930s little car. I think it's rather like the model for Noddy and Big Ear's drop head, something I always rather liked. I saw it at an auction some years ago. It was a complete wreck. And have gradually brought it back to life. The engine runs, the gearbox works and so on. The bodywork, being a total mess, is about 70% finished. Now I'm spending happy hours rubbing it down to the metal, filling places where in some cases I should really weld metal back in, but my welding skills are rather limited. And then later on to coach paint it. I'm not really capable, I think, and certainly don't have the facilities to spray paint it. So it usually keeps me quiet. Otherwise, apart from bits and pieces around the house, busily killing spiders, they seem to multiply here like Billy-O. It's a countryside thing. I don't enjoy getting rid of them. But if I was to leave them be, this house would be a sort of spider's hostel. You wouldn't be able to see the place in 2 or 3 years. So it has to be done. I don't like it. There are some people who are sort of impervious to that sort of thing. Maybe I'm a little bit too soft. Wiping out little lives like that. However, on to the business. I saw an excellent podcast by Andrew Doyle, to such an extent that I thought to make some remarks about it. It's entitled "The Government Report That Wants You to Inoculate, in apostrophes, You Against Wrongthink." This is a report, I think, emanating from the combined efforts of 2 UK universities, one being Edinburgh, I've forgotten the other one, which has been submitted for approval to Mr. Burnham himself. I don't like calling him Andy, Andrew Burnham, because it's a serious job he's doing, and shortenings of names are sort of, I don't know what, sort of a bit faux democratic, sort of chumminess, which isn't really there. This man is serious. Beneath his sort of beer and sandwiches smile, you have a man who is ideologically convinced, and they are very, very serious individuals, if only because they tend, because they know everything, not to listen, be intolerant of contradiction, and also immune from any observational evidence that might come their way. You see, if you know the utopia and where we've got to go, all that stuff is at best a distraction, and at worst something to be obliterated, because it might stop you from leading everybody else by the nose to heaven on earth. They're very dangerous people. And history is littered with people like that, including Uncle Joe, which I'm not going to repeat my little story about him. It gets a bit dull doing that too often. So anyway, Burnham notes in this report a clever idea apparently would be to foresee what misinformation might arise. For misinformation, read anything which goes against what we believe is right. And if you foresee that, you need to pre-bunk the population by inoculating them, by giving them the right information, so when the naughty people start trying to lead people astray like a sort of super malevolent Pied Piper, they will see through this cunning trick that is preventing people from believing the wondrous thoughts and objectives and procedures that the ideologically wise know to be right. It's really quite amazing. Some people call it Orwellian, but I think it's more than that. This is really very, very calculated. It's sort of Edmund Bernays, I'm not certain which one, the propagandist, the one who famous for his torches for freedom, which were cigarettes which he encouraged women to use to display their liberation in the 1920s and 30s. It was sponsored by Lucky Strike, which again is rather ironic. It's as good as saying with hindsight, cancer is freedom. Given his due, maybe he was unaware of that, but that was the case. Oh, he also, clever man, hoodwinked, maybe to our benefit, tens of thousands of Americans, United States citizens, I should say, to enlist to participate in World War One. The principle that he followed was that an effective propaganda was to convince people they're getting a good deal, when maybe they're not. And this can go right down to supermarket offers, 2-for-1 offers, or they call them all bog off, I think it is. And then you find out if you take a 2-for-1, the actual price you pay for two is less than the price for two singular items, which you may be able to buy elsewhere. Similar sort of trick is applied to loose potatoes, believe it or not. And the naive, and I was one of them, thought if you buy potatoes loose, they'd be less expensive than the packaged ones. Oh no, I was well taken in. Anyway, this article by Doyle is remarkable, and I do recommend it. He's a very, very thoughtful man. Even though his Substack, and I am actually paying to get stuff from him, only kicks out half or a quarter of many other people, in terms of value for money, I rate him higher than most. He will certainly be higher than me, but then I'm just an amateur compared to him. So I'm going to read out, first of all, a comment from a man who goes by the nickname or whatever, Graham L. He has a Substack, which is worth looking at. And he remarks about that piece: a government actually employing the warped mindsets of hope, not brains, hate, presumably didn't even watch the TV documentary about them, which provided enough information for the perceptive to see what they were like and how they were motivated, and of course, they're, in brackets, essential these days, uncrushable self-righteousness. It's interesting to note how serious concerns about false and misleading information are virtually incapable of engaging with the subtle concept of how their own mindsets and policies must necessarily be vulnerable to having been influenced by, in apostrophes, false and misleading information, and that the only possible safeguard against this is the freedom of expression, and having to engage with arguments or viewpoints you don't want or like to agree with, as opposed to being dead sly and manipulating them out of existence, while almost never approaching the humility of, well, we might actually be wrong, or perhaps we have something to learn, God forbid, or the situation, we need to think about reframing it. A great start for that, of course, is being embedded in diversity is our strength. We need all these immigrants, and people who disagree with us are just, you can enter the favoured term, e.g. bigot, Islamophobe, racist, far-right, etc. God, this is boring now. Can't people see how it's just a lazy and stupid substitute for starting to think? He wrote that in one paragraph. It could be split into two, even three, but I quite like it as one, because, as you know, individual words and phrases metamorphose into meaning, and in that meaning metamorphoses with other phrases, clauses, sentences, paragraphs, chapters, sentences, books, and possibly could claim libraries of books are metamorphic into culture, a combination of the books. So long paragraphs aren't always bad at all. They can give you a landscape of what someone's saying, instead of this sort of strange modern practice of chopping things up into little staccato sentences. Anyway, back to the subject. I read his remarks and was impressed, and replied to him at length. Of course, I've got to find the reply now. And several other replies popped up, each one, in a way, more illuminating. It's quite rare to find such quality, because very often you have to wade through one reply after the next, which is not only tedious, but dull, and you don't often learn from it. But from this bunch of replies, I learnt quite a bit. So I replied to Graham L. as follows. In this one, first bit is a quote. Virtually incapable of engaging with the subtle concept of how their own mindsets and policies must necessarily be vulnerable. I reply 100%. The prime target of propaganda is not a supposed mass of stupid automata to program them into human conformity necessary to make deluded utopian plans to work. Rather, it is to manipulate the most vulnerable to surrender their agency, being a dangerously large part of the educated and intelligent. Once included, pre-programmed political and social judgment is determined by ideological logic based on axioms such as those found in Engels' A Communist Confession of Faith. So what I'm saying here is that normal working people, or maybe uneducated people, are much less vulnerable to propaganda. And the real target of an effective propaganda is not what Marx might have called the lumpen proletariat, or, which he held in some contempt, but the educated and intelligent. They're most vulnerable and also most dangerous. Going back to my remarks. The irony is that those keen to dehumanize the majority of the population in a program to make them conform to ideological dictate are, in a psychological term, projecting their own artificial stupidity. Most uneducated people have a natural suspicion of long words, in apostrophes, with an intuitive sense that they can mislead and manipulate. But educated people, who are often remote from utilitarian necessities dominating physical reality in day-to-day work, are highly vulnerable to closed-system ideological political theories. It's they who are most vulnerable and the prime target of all effective propaganda, not least because they have the most to lose. Once on side, they will manipulate and, where necessarily, force those not so stupid to surrender their agency to ideological obedience, where they absolutely surrender theirs in all moral and social matters. The former know what they are forced to do is likely to be immoral and inhuman. The latter, that's the educated and intelligent, inculcated and possessed by propaganda, imbued with monumental artificial stupidity, generally believe they are shining paradigms of virtue. It is a bit sobering that things could come to this stage, but it is happening. I'll go on just to read something Graham L. wrote after this. And I conclude in my remark, after talking about paradigms of virtue. I reckon the majority of MPs are so afflicted. Graham L. replied, MPs are a bit of a complicated category. There are among them the genuinely socially concerned. All we need is yet another murdered MP with the resulting stories of how many examples there are of how they have authentically sacrificed much of their time and energy to do things for others and for their society. There will always, of course, be strong personality looking out for their own social status types and taking ruthless advantage of expenses without a moment considering whether they are morally legitimate or whether the rules need some amendment, or should I say reform. We all know they're a particular type of thick-skinned person, and we couldn't face the kind of vitriol and threats that they do, so we have to warily give them some respect as a necessary but possibly warped and fallible feature of a democratic society. There are astonishing examples of apparent incompetence and stupidity among them. Zach Polanski is only one example among many. But the real problem is probably in education. People usually surrender their agency by the time they're about 14 and now spend their lives recycling cliches and memes from others on social media. They stop reading books. They stop actually having to think real-world examples. There should be courses on this in our schools, illustrated by real-world examples. Of course, that would be accompanied by the potential danger of bringing up a generation that actually does learn to think for itself on a widespread basis. So it won't happen under a left-wing government then. I would add to Graham Allen's remarks, well, I agree entirely with that, except I think it's more left or right-wing government today, because certainly, yes, I think so, all on the authoritarian spectrum. They're not interested in democracy. They never were. They went along with it, particularly when there was opposition. They smokescreened in the same way O'Brien, when he tortured Winston, said in the end, as he called them, the Nazis and the communists were only interested in power for its own sake. All the rest, the hoo-ha, the jargon, the I don't know what, communist articles of faith, confessions of faith a la Engels, the whole lot was just a smokescreen to manipulate and get people into a position where they are forced to conform, or that they're mentally, as it were, programmed to conform in a state where they believe that the ideology is ultimate truth and is part of their very being, because their thoughts are controlled by ideology, which in effect divorces intervention of the mind and consciousness. But if they feel that someone is dissing the ideology that is controlling their thoughts, even though they don't control their own thoughts at this stage, they take that as an existential threat to their existence. So ideologues often will fight to the death to protect what has stripped them of agency and turned them into political and social automata. Inhuman in extreme. And yet, anyone who attacks ideology, they take as attacking their humanity. The irony and paradox is overwhelming. And it's there. I've seen it in people's faces occasionally when they talk to me. Not often, but, and then they get very confused because I start saying things they agree with. But then they reassure themselves and turn back and think that this fellow I'm talking to really doesn't need to be around. He's a danger. And I should stop listening to him. Because if I listen to him, it's a subtext, I might have to abandon the thinking, the automatic thinking of ideology. And then where will I be? They're very inadequate people because they're frightened of thinking for themselves. And they find it very comforting to have this sort of prescriptive thought, pre-established, as it were, thinking machine in their thinking and independent of their consciousness. It's wonderful. Anyway, I reply to GL on his last remarks. which end off, so it won't happen under a left-wing government then with this. It's worth noting that 1984 has gradually slipped off the English curriculum over the last 25 years. There's some hope for at least a significant minority of MPs, and I agree with you, your more nuanced remarks in contrast to my shouty ones. You're right about a generation that could think for itself, as opposed to one that lets ideology do thinking about morality, politics and society for them. Closed system axiomatic thinking destroys reason. Engels listed communist axioms in his Confession of Faith. Anne Graham replied, "Oh dear, I need to get a placard and start marching outside school saying bring back 1984. Brackets, for all the right reasons, of course." And I replied, which would be open to misinterpretation. Perhaps bring on rather than bring back. It is wonderfully ironic that the sort of left-wing ideologues, but it could be any ideologue, it could be a right-wing ideologue, anyone who's lets their thoughts be controlled by a political theory, an axiomatic theory, it's what happens. They're wishing for their own mental death, in effect, because in a highly ideological state, which is strongly disciplined, and all ideology has discipline built into it, and that's usually enforced by the educated and intelligent, people can't talk openly at all. They have to whisper, if at all. And in extreme, an ideology goes some way to its objective, which is to destroy thinking. Thinking is dangerous. Thinking could let people disagree, and disagreement is completely forbidden in an ideological state. And that's a bit awkward, because the very nature of reason depends, by the third paradox, on accepting that you have to take contradictions seriously to be able to resolve it, or maybe to be able to realise that you happen to be wrong, so you resolve the contradiction in yourself. I'm asking you to do that now to a certain extent, because you may not only believe a quarter of what I'm saying, or none at all. But if you got to this stage, then I think you understand that it needs a form of intellectual patience and tolerance to be able to reason. And in daily life, to get round do most things, you have to accept that there's no such thing as certainty. And if there's no such thing as certainty, you have to make judgments and you have to take risks. And both of those involve acceptance that such behaviour in terms of logic, pure logic, is unacceptable. But you have to do it. And it works in those cases. There are certain examples that illustrate how you can make mistakes. There's a famous, I've forgotten exactly, it's the Monty something problem. Used to be a show in 1950s America. And it reveals how normal assumptions about a simple probability experiment that people make are wrong. It's very clever. So we do make this sort of mistakes. But in the end, a lot of stuff we have to do is simply non-logical. For instance, if I want to cross a road and I look at a car coming from one direction, I judge whether I get across the road before it hits me, or ideally before it blows its horn and gets fed up with me, or even better, when it's safe, you know. Now, if you look at the movement, I'm judging movement there, because if you apply logic to movement, you fall into a thing called Zeno's paradox, which is in effect, if you try and describe it absolutely, you go second, half second, split second, thousandths of second, minute second, blah, blah, blah. You can't do it. It's called reductio ad absurdum. Russell said something about that paradox as being one of the possibly the most important of them all. He was right. I don't think he understood, though, the implications of it, which are massive. They're as big as Epimenides' paradox, which is to do with trust in society, which goes like this. Epimenides said, a Cretan has said all Cretans are liars. Well, it's obviously the liar's paradox, because if you believe him and he's a liar, then you're stuck. If you don't believe him, well, same sort of thing. You can't get any sense out of that. But it had a nice double twist, because Epimenides was a Cretan. And that the essence of language lies in trust. And the basis of language, unlike Wittgenstein fans and many others, is rooted in shared physiology of perception and brain structure, which is shared with all people. There is a commonality in all languages, which is rooted in that. For instance, we all see things intermittently. We all recognize unity when we see an object by the contradiction due to shade, parallax, what do you call it, move your head around, it looks different, changes in colour and so on and so forth. That observation is quite alien to a lot of people, in philosophy anyway. They still have this strange, wild belief that Wittgenstein, who ignored a shared physiology of perception, who subjected humans to inhumanity in that situation, is some kind of intellectual god. It's so weird, these intellectual hang-ups, which turn otherwise very intelligent, educated people, sensible people, into super artificial idiots. Idiot's wrong, don't know, it's going a bit far, but certainly, well, I don't know in the Greek sense, because idiotes means private citizen, so to that extent, not so far off. It turns them into antisocial creatures, because understanding how we communicate and respecting it involves respect for other people, individuals, and the process also needs an understanding of the bedrock of reason, which necessarily involves respect for contradiction and temporarily suspending the law of non-contradiction to save contradiction from self-destruction, to save it from itself. So there you go. It's a bit of a sideline to this discussion, but we're coming back to essential trust. And that trust is threatened when a government tries to inoculate people. I mean, the very expression is sort of, it's inhuman. Yes, we have bodies which are, subject to laws of physics and this and that, but our intellect, our subjectivity is another realm. The rules of existence are different in our subjectivity, and they're different in the intersubjective, and they are different in physical reality. What is in the intersubjective, which is a product of mutual agreement about subjectivity, but less consciousness than physical presence, you can have incoherent and consistent entities, which are valid and which exist. In the physical realm, no, you can't. And these people, who are keen on censorship and so on and so forth, subscribe to the idea that somehow or other the intersubjective is part of physical reality. In other words, there is no difference between the two. It's just one might be one bit of physical reality, other bit of physical reality. Alternatively, they want to subsume physical reality into the intersubjective. So you get two sets of rules of existence, which is supposed to persist in the same domain. It's nonsense. Serious nonsense. Now, it doesn't mean to say there isn't a connection between all three. The intersubjective is hugely influential, there's no doubt about that. It has no agency. The bears, wolves, what do you call them, double-headed eagles, flags and all that rubbish in intersubjective. They're influence, but they're not reality. They can't cause anything. It's people who choose or accept the influence that then become dangerous. The others are mere devices used by political parties to con people in many cases to surrender their agency to some kind of belief that the abstraction can subsume their agency en masse with all the other people to create a monster that can somehow have a huge battle with evil capitalists or ghastly communists or, I don't know, some other, the ungodly, the theocrats get very upset about. It's a weird belief. Lack of distinction and discipline, understanding about the way what language is, what subjectivity is, and what physical reality is at the core of this nonsense. And these censors have no idea. Their ignorance is, I would like to say Olympian, but the gods knew quite a lot. But certainly in dimension it's Olympian. In significance it's Olympian. It's really shocking. Anyway, Andrew Doyle's article doesn't go that far, but it's a very good article, and I recommend you look at it because it's well founded. He's a very acerbic, sharp and clear thinker. Unlike me, I'm a bit messy, but I'm an amateur. Well, thanks for listening. Do have a look at that. I'll leave the link to Andrew Doyle's article in the where I normally put the text of this sort of thing, just beneath the screen showing me chatting to you now. Do take a look at it. I know often people don't look at things without them, but this is one of the best I've ever read. Not that my great reading is that wide. I've only started reading again the last 10, 15 years, after a good 40 years of doing normal work. Thanks again. It's more positive this time. Understanding this sort of thing is critical. And once we get the intellectual basis sorted out, and that will involve destroying the foundations of Marxism. It'll involve destroying the foundations of whatever you call them, fascism and Nazism. They are different, definitely different, and making certain that theocracy doesn't rise its bloody head too far, if at all. Then we can get on and have the best society we could have in the circumstances. That's critical. Anyone who talks about a fixed utopia is very dangerous. And all ideologues, and I think most theocrats, if not all, subscribe to that desperately dangerous and, I know it's insulting, primitive belief. Anyway, bye for now. Oh, sorry to wobble a bit.